So moving on to chapter 2 now then, and we're going to start in the same way as we started looking at chapter 1, okay? So we've got the key moment in chapter 2. We've got the bunkhouse that gets introduced, so the setting starts, the description of setting starts the chapter the same way as that it did in chapter 1 where it described the brush. The first character that we meet is Candy on the ranch with George and Lenny. Then the boss. Obviously we learn a little bit more about George and Lenny's relationship in this chapter as well because we see them in this chapter. We meet Curley, Curley's wife, Slim, and then Curley returns at the end of this chapter as well. As well as going through obviously the key moments and looking at some of the key characters, we're also still going to continue to link to themes and context on each slide. If we start by looking at the setting then, the setting of the bunkhouse. So as I said on the previous slide, the opening description of the setting is the same then as chapter 1 opened, where it described nature, the outdoors, down by the stream where George and Lenny were. Well, in this case now, we've got obviously a stark contrast with regards to setting, where the bunkhouse gets described. So we had this beautiful, tranquil setting in chapter 1, which has now been juxtaposed in chapter 2 with obviously the entirely different description of the bunkhouse. We've got this idea of the freedom of nature in chapter 1 contrasted with this harsh life on the ranch that kind of gets revealed to us within the description of the bunkhouse. Obviously you can see a picture there from a stage production of Mice and Men. Okay, that's very similar to what is being described to us in the book. Whereas they've got chairs there and a table, in the actual text they are sitting on boxes, so they haven't actually got the luxury of even a chair. Okay, so that's slightly different to the description that's in the text. So it's incredibly impersonal and basic setting. Okay, lacks any privacy. If we imagine that these grown men are all going to be living there in that one space, it's very cramped, basic, and like I said, quite impersonal. It's described as a rectangular building at the start, okay, whitewashed walls, floor unpainted. It's very a functional place, it's not homely at all, and it's a place where the men wouldn't necessarily want to stay for long. And they are there to work, so the boss isn't going to make this place very comfortable for them because he wants them there for one thing, which is to work. Now, we discussed this in class, the fact that this description of the setting of the bunkhouse does kind of make us think of a prison, okay? There's some very small windows, it's quite dark in there, and like I said, very basic, the bunk beds and so on. So it's definitely not a very welcoming place. There are limited space for the personal possessions of the men. They just simply have an apple box with the opening forward, so they've made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of each of the occupants of the bunk. So an apple box is just like a square wooden box, okay, that's attached to the wall with 2 shelves. So there's not much space for their belongings, but obviously we know that as migrant workers, they haven't got many belongings because all of their belongings they're carrying around on their backs. So there's not much to put in there anyway, and they can't afford to buy luxuries for themselves. So everything is kind of basic and minimum with regards to their possessions. And this really does indicate their social status as migrant or itinerant workers as well. We see reference to medicines that they have, which could emphasise the men have ailments, they're not particularly well, and need medicines for this. There's also a lack of entertainment for them. The only entertainment they have is playing cards, sitting on boxes, not chairs. They also get to play horseshoes as well outside, and then go to Susie's place on a Saturday night, and that's about it really. So it's incredibly basic, and enjoyment isn't really and entertainment isn't really encouraged by the boss. Okay, as I said earlier, they're there to work. You've got the light imagery in this opening description as well. The sun that threw a dust-laden bar into the room. The light we talked about in class could be seen as a symbol of hope. Obviously, in this case, there's a tiny bit of light coming in, which suggests that there's not a lot of, positivity. There's not a lot of hope in the future for these men. The light is mostly blocked out, which obviously could be foreshadowing events that are to come at the end of the text. But obviously, you've got the dust-laden bar as well. The sun shines up the dust in the room, again suggesting that this is incredibly basic, room, but it's also unclean and unhygienic as well. You got flies shooting around like Russian stars as well. That's a simile there. Incredibly unhygienic environment for these men to be living in. Okay, so the themes in this chapter now, and particularly in this description of the bunkers at the start, is definitely loneliness. So they're not encouraged to kind of, stay at this place. This place isn't very welcoming. They're not encouraged to stay there for very long. So they have an incredibly lonely existence, and it's an incredibly isolated place as well. We know from George in chapter 1 that the bus driver won't even drive up to the ranch, which should tell you how isolated the place is, and then how isolated the lives of these men are. Okay, so the context for this chapter then, obviously we find out a little bit about the migrant workers' lives through this description of the bunkhouse, what their lives were like during the Great Depression, and also in chapter 2 we get introduced to this kind of idea of racism, prejudice against black people, obviously telling us something about the context of the time as well. If we move on to look at candy now then, okay, so candy is a term in America that they use to describe sweets. So candy, being given the nickname Candy in Of Mice and Men, could indicate that he's quite a sweet character, and he is quite a sweet old man, Candy, and he definitely gets a lot of sympathy from the reader in the text. So Candy is the first character that we meet in chapter 2, the first character that we're introduced to through his description, after we've had the description of the bunkhouse. He's described as the old swamper and a tall, stoop-shouldered old man, and the adjective old gets repeated quite frequently throughout this chapter. So firstly, if we look at the word swamper then, so a swamper is another word for a cleaner. So Candy is basically the cleaner on the ranch. Now we soon learn that he's got a stump-like wrist, which indicates that he's lost his wrist on a accident on the ranch. So he actually lost his wrist on this ranch, made him injured, and obviously the only thing he can then do is clean up on the ranch. So he's wondering, quite a lot throughout this novel, when he's going to be kind of disposed of and they're not going to need his services anymore. He's quite scared of being canned, as we hear throughout, isn't he? Okay. Now Candy acts as the narrator for the reader. He gives us the backgrounds on lots of the characters. He introduces the characters to us before we actually see them in the text. And this might indicate that he's the ranch gossip. As well as being the ranch gossip, Candy links in then with the key theme of loneliness as well, because obviously he's quite keen to have somebody to speak to, which is why he so enjoys speaking to George and Lenny for so long at the start and filling them in about the other characters on the ranch. So with regards to the theme of hierarchy of jobs, we can see Candy being a cleaner is at the bottom of the hierarchy, whereas you would have somebody then like the boss right at the top. We don't even know the boss's name. He's just called the boss, which would indicate his status to us. So he'd be somewhere at the top and Candy then at the bottom. Now, if we look at the theme of prejudice as well, Candy would link into this here. Candy's old and he's also disabled. Now, Candy is prejudiced against in the novel purely because of these factors, and he really does show us, when we think of context, about what it's like to be old and disabled in the 1930s and how these people would get treated. Candy's waiting to be canned and almost disposed of, in the same way that they got rid of his dog when he was no longer useful. So this, Candy really clearly gives us an insight into people with old age and disabilities and how they were treated during that era. So he goes on to tell us about the boss as well. He tells us the boss was sore as hell that George and Lenny didn't turn up, and that he's also a pretty nice fella, and he gives the example of how generous he was one Christmas when he gave the men a gallon of whiskey. So this presents the boss through Candy's eyes, obviously, but as a particularly fair boss, which was quite unusual during this era. Typical ranch owners, landowners, would mistreat their workers and would certainly not be sort of, giving them a gallon of whiskey at Christmas. However, this is the only one generous act that Candy lists. So this is a small kind of token, but it's at least something to keep the men happier at Christmas then. So it gives us the impression that the boss is a little bit nicer than perhaps some other ones. The boss also gave the stablebuck hell as the stablebuck's a nigger. Okay, so that's a quote from the novel, and we know an incredibly racist term as well to describe a black person. But this was commonplace during this era. So this links quite closely with obviously the context of the novel, racism in the 1930s and so on. So they used words like nigger, negro, to describe a black person, which is obviously, incredibly racist as we know it today. But obviously this was kind of casual racism during the time that would be accepted. George isn't even shocked to be hearing this term and actually repeats it back to him, just as soon as he said it in the novel. So with the fact that the boss gives the stableback hell, suggests that Crooks, the stableback, is a scapegoat for the boss. He's someone that the boss kind of takes his anger out of. When we think of hierarchy of jobs, Crooks is a stableback. He tends to the horses, so his job is lower down the hierarchy, particularly compared to the boss who owns the place. So he gets, taken advantage of, and is used as a scapegoat because of the colour of his skin. Candy comments as well that he reads a lot. He's got books in his room. So obviously, if that was a commonplace that a lot of the men on the ranch read, Candy wouldn't need to say it. So it's clearly unusual. Candy sees it as unusual that he is reading and he's got lots of books. The fact that he's got lots of books as well in his possession tells us that he's actually got a little bit more than the other men, who we know have got very few belongings. But obviously, as we read on, we find that the Crooks is more of a permanent member on this ranch than the others, and he has accumulated lots of possessions. But the fact that he can read suggests that, despite being black, and if we think of the stereotypical kind of image of a black person in this era, perhaps uneducated and so on, Crooks defies that stereotype. He's intelligent, he's literate, and this gives him a little bit of a higher status on the ranch, really, because he's perhaps a little bit more intelligent than the others. But unfortunately, it's his skin colour then that brings Crooks further down the hierarchy. Okay, the fact that Crooks doesn't socialise with them at all and isn't allowed, is segregated from the others, is suggested in Candy's quote there. They let the nigger come in that night, so it's one night that they, using the pronoun they to describe the other men on the ranch. Candy didn't really have a choice in this. It was them that kind of took the lead here, which shows how powerless Candy is. But they let the nigger, as in Crooks, come in for one night. But this was to be involved in a fight, if you remember that the description from Candy in chapter 2. So as well as being allowed in just once, it shows the way he's treated, but the fact that he's used to fight others would suggest that Crooks is very much treated like an animal. Okay, so this tells us lots about context. These quotes from Candy, the fact that the society was incredibly racist. The American dream is going to be prevalent because obviously Crooks reads a lot and is almost trying to better himself. But the American dream is going to be completely impossible for Crooks because he's obviously black, okay, and we know black people were treated during this era. Power is really important here. Those who lack power because of certain things, Candy certainly, okay, and Crooks as is mentioned here. And then who has power? Obviously the boss. And as I mentioned earlier, old age, people with disabilities. So Candy really gives us an insight into how these people were treated during the 1930s in America. We talked a little bit about the boss in the previous slide, so just a few more quotes then. He is only seen in chapter 2 because, as it says, he's not a labouring man, so he's not necessarily needed in any other part of the novel. He's not going to be in the bunkhouse, the barn and so on, because he doesn't do any of the work. But we do see him in chapter 2 when he first meets George and Lenny. Now we know he was sore as hell that they didn't turn up for work, so he's already quite angry because they are late. So the first description of the boss in chapter 2 then is his clothing. Now he's wearing similar clothing to the other men, aside from the fact that his soiled brown Stetson hat and high-heeled boots, and he was also wearing spurs to prove that he was not a labouring man. So as I said, the clothing he's wearing is indicative of the fact that he's actually your common migrant worker or ranch hand like the others on the ranch, okay? He also is quite suspicious when George and Lenny talk to him. We know that George has asked Lenny not to speak and has warned him, and this makes the boss quite suspicious. He says, "I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I'd like to know what your interest is." So he's incredibly suspicious, and this shows us that during this era, if we look at the context, of migrant workers, what kind of lives they led during the Great Depression, it was quite unusual to see two men travelling together, which is what raises suspicions from the boss, and which is why George and Lenny's friendship, raises suspicion from some of the other men on the ranch as well, because it's so unusual. These men usually travelled alone. And he even sort of suggests that George is taking Lenny's pay away from him. So this does show that he has some respect and concern for the men on the ranch, and linking back to Candy's comment that he's actually a pretty nice fella, the fact that he would be concerned that actually Lenny wouldn't be getting his pay and George would be having it. However, despite these factors, the way he's presented in this chapter, is incredibly demanding and controlling of the conversation. And he is reflecting, like I said earlier, of what the bosses were like during the Great Depression, and how harsh they were, the power that they held, the authority that they had over these men. And one wrong word from George or Lenny in this conversation would have resulted in them being sent away. So both, George knows the importance of this conversation and making sure that the boss doesn't kind of suspect anything and actually keeps them on the ranch. Okay, so for context there, for themes, you've got a hierarchy again, the boss being at the top, obviously, and having all the power and authority, George and Lenny being towards the bottom because they're migrant workers. And then, through this conversation with the boss, we also see what ranch life was like for these men in the 1930s. George and Lenny are then left alone after the boss exits, and George obviously turns on Lenny for almost ruining the conversation and damn near losing us the job. So George is obviously incredibly frustrated again and angry with Lenny. You always forget, and I got to talk you out of it. Now he's got his eye on us. So you can see George's increasing frustration with Lenny continued on from chapter 1. That Lenny and his fear that Lenny is going to get into trouble now. George had said to the boss previously that he was kicked in the head when he was younger, and Lenny says, I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? The fact that he turns that into question shows that Lenny is quite uncertain about that event and is incredibly childlike, and then pleased that George had said he was his cousin when obviously he isn't. So he presents himself as much like a child here again, and you can see all he wants to do is please George once again. So you can see what kind of friendship they've got, whereas George is quite angry and frustrated with him. Still, obviously, we've still got to question why George goes round with him if he is as frustrating as George would lead us to believe. So we've got to think about what George gets out of that as well. When Lenny is pleased to hear that he might be George's, George has said he's like his cousin. George is quite cruel with his reaction. That was a lie. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself, and so on. So once again, you see the context here, how careful these migrant workers have to be in conversations with the boss, because obviously they can just lose their jobs instantly, and that that's how important that was during that era. But you also see lots of anger from George here on George's part, threats of violence, and George's power over Lenny essentially, okay, which is a key theme in this novel as well. Curley then enters this chapter. Now we know Curley is the boss's son, and the first description for Curley is his tightly curled hair. When we think of him having a sort of a head of curls, and we think of a curl, we think of Curley potentially as being having quite a wound up personality. He's quite hot tempered, he's easily angered, and we see that as soon as he meets George and Lenny in this chapter. We see that he wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. So the high-heeled boots there would kind of give us his status or his hierarchy on the ranch. He's the boss's son, so he would be much further up the hierarchy than a lot of the other characters on the ranch. But the fact that he does wear a work glove would suggest that he does do some kind of work, whereas the boss wasn't a labouring man. So Curly does do some, but nowhere near as much as the others. So you've also got then the fact that his arms were gradually bent at the elbows and his hands were closed into fists. Now we find out from Candy later on that he's pretty handy. He's a boxer, he's a lightweight. So that his arms being gradually bent at the elbows, his hands closed into fists, almost like Curly being almost prepared to fight, even just going into this bunkhouse here and seeing George and Lenny for the first time. He's stiffened. He went into a slight crouch, almost like as if he's in the ring, okay, getting ready to kind of, punch and defend himself from punches. And then his glance then was at once calculated and pugnacious. So calculating, it's quite a premeditated description. It's almost like he's sizing the men up for a fight. And then he's described as being pugnacious as well, and pugnacious means that he's almost ready to fight. And bear in mind, George and Lenny haven't actually done anything to him here, okay? So we see definitely the themes of anger and violence hinted at heavily in association with Curly, and obviously the hierarchy as well, being that he's at the top of the hierarchy, and George and Lenny would be a lot further down. So there are lots of verbs and adverbs, used to describe associated with Curly. and they usually make us think of anger, aggression, violence, and so on. So he's described as glancing coldly, so the adverb coldly there would suggest that he's not very welcoming character at all. Lashing his body around, that's quite a quick movement, one that we would associate, again, Curly's a boxer when he's in the ring, so he's very quick and he's easily angered, he's quite a threatening character. And then he stared levelly at them, almost as a source of intimidation for the two men. So they haven't done anything to have this type of behaviour directed towards them either. So we can only assume that Curly has got issues, definitely, certainly with his anger, which does have a lot to do with his size, which we find out a couple of other points down now. Candy tells us, like I said, that he's a boxer. He's pretty handy in the ring. He's good with his fists, basically, and he's a lightweight. He's like a lot of little guys. So we know that Curly could potentially have something called small man syndrome. He's quite paranoid of the fact that he is quite small, and as a result, he hates big guys. So we already know from the description in chapter 1 that Lenny is a huge guy. So Lenny and Curly are likely to have some kind of conflict, purely because Curly hates big guys because he is so small, and that might also be a reason for the high heel boots as well as showing his status. He's always trying to elevate himself to be bigger than what he actually is, and he's all the time then picking scraps with big guys. So he's quite an aggressive, like I said, violent man. He got married a couple of weeks ago. Seems that Curly's cockier than ever since he got married. So he got married potentially 2-3 weeks before the novel has been set. And this is what's come with this is arrogance. He's got a woman, and the men on the ranch won't have a woman, so he feels that he's superior as a result of this. Okay, then you've got that derogatory statement about the glove on his left hand being full of Vaseline, that he's keeping his hand soft for his wife. So obviously Candy has heard this information. Candy's no friend of Curly's, but Curly's been passing this around the ranch to the men, which is extremely disrespectful way to speak about his wife. So this kind of tells us about the sexist era that they were living in as well, and this kind of position that women, the treatment of women, the way in which they were treated, the fact that her sex life is the discussion of the other workers on the ranch is extremely disrespectful, as I said. Okay, so that links in with obviously the context of the time. And the sexist way in which women were presented. But there's a potential sign of weakness on Curly's part as well. There's a suggestion there that he has to please his wife, with his hand essentially, because potentially he can't please her in the traditional sense, and we discussed this in class, didn't we? Curly could potentially be impotent, which is a sign of his weakness there, as well as feeling that he's small and he's got an inferiority complex against big guys. And this could just be another reason. So there's two ways to understand that he's being extremely disrespectful, talking about his sex life to the men, but also it could be a sign of weakness on Curly's part. Okay, married 2 weeks and got the eyes. This is Candy's description of Curly's wife. So he tells us, obviously, we know about the boss before we meet him, we know about Crooks before we meet him, we know about Curly as well, and now we know about Curly's wife through Candy before we've even met her. And Candy's descriptions of her being a tart and having the eye really do prejudice the reader against Curly's wife even before we've met her. So the theme of prejudice comes in here, okay, and the power that she lacks because she is a woman. So the phrase "got the eye" would suggest that she's looking at other men when she's newly married. And again, the woman is to blame here. She's, Candy's incredibly sexist, that she's the one looking at the other men when she's married. However, we do know later on in the text, Curly goes down with these men on a Saturday night, down to the brothel, down to Susie's place, and nobody bats an eyelid at Curly doing that. So it's, incredible double standards for men and women here, and this kind of masculine dominance that was prevalent in this era as well, over women. Okay, and when we think of hierarchy again, Curly's wife is at the bottom there because she is a woman, but she would inevitably be higher up than some of the men purely because she's married to Curly. Okay, Candy calls her a tart, and you've got the ellipsis there with the pause before he says it. He gives a suggestion there that she's obviously flirting with other men, she's acting in a quite promiscuous manner, potentially going with the other men as well. And like I said, this really does prejudiced as towards her before we ever met her. Okay, and this kind of conversation with Curley here that George and Lenny have, and the way Candy speaks about him and his wife, just gives a bit of an insight of what ranch life was like for women in this era, but also for the men too. You know, it was a time of suspicion. It was very harsh, quite a violent environment, and we see this through Curley's behaviour in this part of the chapter too. Curley's wife is the next character that's then described in this chapter. The first way that she gets described to us is through her physical description. We also learn she's quite flirtatious, and then how she gets described in this chapter then by George is in a particularly negative way. So firstly, obviously, Curley's wife, if we look at her name firstly, then she hasn't got a name, she's nameless. She is, you know, only sort of described in terms of being Curley's possession. So you've got the possessive apostrophe there, Curley's wife. She belongs to Curley. So she's the only woman on the ranch as well, and she does sort of represent the position of women during the 1930s and how sexist the society was towards women. So we see the context there through Curley's wife. So she's described as having rouged lips. Okay, rouge is a red colour for lips and cheeks. She's also heavily made up, so she's wearing lots and lots of makeup. Nails are red mules. These are like little sort of heels that she's wearing that have got red ostrich feathers on them. And as we discussed in class, you know, all these descriptions suggest that she's quite incongruous to the setting. She doesn't quite fit in with life on a working ranch because she's so heavily made up and so on, okay? Now, obviously the connotations firstly then of the colour red, we've got to think of what red might kind of represent and make us think of. So what is red linked to? So if we think of things like danger, we've got stop signs, you know, red in the traffic lights means stop, so red is like redly associated with danger. A warning sign, it's a colour associated with lust and sexuality as well. So there's no accident Steinbeck chose this colour to refer to Curley's wife, and all of these kind of suggest, all of these descriptions kind of suggest that she might inevitably cause some trouble for the men, and obviously we've got foreshadowing here because we know that this is what eventually does happen in the text. It's interesting to note as well that she's referred to as being a girl in this description, so this might emphasise how actually young Curley's wife is. I think we forget that, how young and potentially naive she is, and how, you know, this does kind of reveal then her innocence despite being heavily made up the way she is, and we've already been quite prejudiced against her because of Candy, and this description doesn't help with that at all either, does it? Okay, so she's also described as being quite flirtatious in her behaviour. She puts her hand behind her back, leans against the door frame, throwing her body forward, so she uses her body to get attention. Obviously she's the only woman on the ranch, so the men are obviously going to look, and as she says there, nobody can blame a person for looking. So, you know, is she referring to the fact that she's looking in at the men or the men looking at her? That's not quite clear, but she is being quite flirtatious in her manner. However, when she sees Lenny looking her up and down, we know that Lenny's fascinated with her, and we know obviously that the link to Curley's wife with the colour red and the fact that he touched a girl's red dress in weed, and there's a lot of heavy foreshadowing there. But the fact that she bridled a little when Lenny was looking at her suggests that she doesn't particularly like Lenny's attention. Now, Lenny isn't going to be discreet, he's going to just be staring at her, and potentially bridling there could suggest that she's a bit uncomfortable with that attention from Lenny specifically. And then Slim comes in, says that Curley's looking for her, and then she gets suddenly apprehensive and hurried away. So the hint there is that she's quite fearful of Curley, potentially. We know how Curley was presented in the last slide. This is her husband, so she's definitely quite scared of Curley. So we've got the theme of fear here, and the power, obviously, that Curley's wife, you know, is lacking, being a woman in this era, and loneliness as well. You know, it's all very well to see Curley's wife in a negative way here through the way Steinbeck presents her, but she's inevitably an incredibly lonely character and just looking for company as well. And unfortunately, he has to use her body in this way to try and get some, because nobody speaks to her otherwise. So the way George speaks about her in this chapter as well is incredibly, you know, sexist. It's negative. He's misogynistic. You know, he doesn't like her, and he doesn't know her not to like her either. He uses purely on what Candy said to him and on the way she's presented herself in the doorway. So he says she's pretty, but she's a tart. She's got the eye. She's a tramp. So this was Candy's descriptions: a tart and got the eye, but George openly says she's a tramp, suggesting that she's quite promiscuous. You know, she sleeps around with other men potentially. She'd clear out for $20 as a link to her potentially being like a prostitute there. You know, sort of doing things for money. He describes her quite harshly as being a bitch. She's poison. She's jailbait. She's going to cause a lot of trouble for these men, and basically rat trap. She's going to entrap them, and it's all her fault essentially. It wouldn't be the men's fault. You know, she's going to get young men. She's young, and she's going to get these men into trouble in George's eyes. So this really does tell us about, you know, how sexist these men were and how these women were treated during this time. But it's important to notice as well, just before Curly's wife even enters, the reference to light. Okay, she blocks off the light in the doorway. If you remember, there's a rectangle of sunshine that she blocks off. So you've got obviously the blocking out of light with Curly's wife as well. She almost brings darkness with her and does block out the light on a lot of dreams and hopes that these men have in the novel. So there's a lot of foreshadowing there through the use of light and the fact that Curly's wife is blocking that even before she comes in. So lots and lots of interesting points about Curly's wife, and she's certainly a character that we need to revise for January, as she is quite likely to come up, okay? Slim is the next character to be introduced in this chapter, and he's the only character that Candy hasn't first gossiped about. So he does it for all the other characters, but just not Slim. And the only thing he says about Slim is that he's a hell of a nice fella. So it's only positive descriptions from Candy for Slim. And then obviously you get Steinbeck then portraying Slim with the third person narrator rather than through Candy's eyes. So he's the character that gets the longest description as well. So he's described as moving with a majesty, so a magnificence or a splendour that's only achieved by royalty and master craftsmen. So initially we get, you know, the description of him as being a very skilled worker, skilled at what he does. He's a jerk line skinner, he's the prince of the ranch, so he's the one that leads the team of mules, and you've got obviously connotations there of royalty, with him being called the actual prince of the ranch. So you kind of see how these men look up to him. So when we think of themes of hierarchy, power and authority, Slim would be at the top of the hierarchy here, sort of underneath Curly and the boss. Just given the description here and how positively he comes across, how well respected he is by the men on the ranch. So he's described as having a gravity in his manner, so things he says are of importance and they're significant, certainly to the other members of the ranch. He was quite quiet, and he was described as being profound. All talk stopped when he spoke. So if we think about the power and authority that he's got, you know, he's got this through respect that these men have for him, unlike Curly, who's got power and authority through, you know, presenting himself in quite a violent, angry way, and obviously by being the boss's son. But Slim is very deep. He's an insightful person, and he's someone the men look up to. His authority there, his key quote for Slim, was so great that his word was taken on any subject, be it politics or love. So he's incredibly trusted. His ear heard more than what was said to him. His tone was friendly, it invited confidence. You know, like I said earlier, he can be trusted, and we see this when George confides in him at the start of chapter 3. People are familiar with Slim. There's a real intimacy there in the way he speaks to the men on the ranch, and he invited confidence without actually demanding it, unlike obviously the way Curly's presented. Ain't many guys travel round together. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. So there's a direct link to context there, what ranch life is like. You know, from Slim, he's very observant. Ranch life was a harsh, suspicious, violent place to be, and that's what Slim says there. Maybe everybody's just scared of each other, because there is that suspicion there that's been raised of why George and Lenny travel around together, because others don't, do they? So we got to think about why Slim's character is significant here. You know, he's like I say, he's linked to themes like hierarchy, friendship, power, authority, and so on. Obviously, with his developing friendship with George on the ranch, with the way the other characters view him, and so on. But also, you know, why is he significant as a character? Why is he being placed in this novel? What is he a symbol for? So we've got him potentially as being a symbol for hope, of a better future after years of the Depression. You know, he's the nicest character on the ranch. He's an incredibly practical man, but he is also empathetic and so on, and you know, the nicest of the men. So does he represent hope that things can get better after years of the Great Depression in the 1930s? Just something for us to think about there with Slim. Immediately after seeing Slim, we've got this complete juxtaposition when you've got Curly re-entering, and you immediately see then the contrast between Slim and Curly, who's got this respected authority that Curly craves and Curly hasn't got. Curly's described again, obviously with these verbs and adverbs, so he bounced in. So again, you've got him almost light on his feet, bouncing in as if getting ready to fight, as if he's in a boxing ring, as we said earlier. He says to them, "Have you seen a girl around here?" he demanded angrily. So you've got the adverb angrily there, which tells us about his angry, hot-tempered sort of personality, as we discussed earlier. And he's always looking for his wife, as she is him. But it's interesting how he doesn't say, "Have you seen my wife?" Now, there is only one girl on the ranch, so they obviously know who he's referring to, but he calls her a girl. So he's not personal about her at all. He doesn't show any affection, very little love for her, which just gives us an insight in the way he feels about his wife. She is more of his possession than she is somebody he loves. When George says she was here, now she's gone back to the house, he says, "What the hell was she doing?" So he's incredibly intimidating, again is angry at the fact that she's been on her own with these men, and the word hell there suggests how angry he actually is. He follows up here with lots of interrogatives, and where was she doing, which way did she go, he demanded at last, and then he's scowling at George. He's just met these men and instantly dislikes them, turns and hurries out the door exactly like his wife does. George's reaction then is, "Lenny, I'm scared I'm going to tangle with this bastard myself." So this is a reaction he's created, through the way he presents himself just in chapter 2, and these men, like I said, haven't done anything to him. So you've got themes of hierarchy again here, with Curly being higher up the hierarchy than these two men, violence, you've got power, and in this case it's Curly abusing his power, being able to speak to these men as he does, because there were very few jobs around, and obviously these men can go and then others can replace them. So he really does abuse the power that he's got in the way he speaks and behaves towards them. You've got context, you've got this masculine dominance, Curly trying to get the better of George saying he's going to tangle with him himself. So it's who's the most powerful, and who's dominated enough. And you've got just the suspicion, and how harsh ranch life was, not a very nice environment to be living in at all. And then obviously this is what it was like to live on these ranches during the Great Depression in the 1930s. So all very useful. Throughout this PowerPoint, you've got lots and lots of key quotes now for all of the key characters that are introduced in chapter 2, and we need to be using these for our revision of these characters prior to this exam in January.